Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Chris Rapley. I'm Director of the Science Museum and also a Professor of Climate Science at University College London. And it's my privilege and pleasure to chair this evening's session. The session is entitled The Great British Refurb, Housing for a Low-Carbon Energy Future, given by Professor Tadj Oreszczyn. And can I just first of all congratulate you on having made it here in spite of the fact that the tubes are not being very helpful tonight. Now, I'm asked to remind you all, could you please turn off your mobile phones? We particularly ask that because you know that they interfere with the sound system, and the reason for the slight delay was that we're being webcast tonight. So in addition to your good selves, potentially an audience of billions out there are watching us on the web. And I've also been asked to point out that this evening's event is part of the Story of London Festival. Now, Tadj Oreszczyn, MCI BSc, PhD, is a Professor of Energy and Environment and head of the Bartlett School of Graduate Studies at University College London. Tadj has over 28 years of energy research experience, mostly focused around the area of energy and buildings. His first degree was in applied physics, followed by a PhD in solar energy. And before becoming a professor, Tadj was the director of the Energy Design Advice Scheme regional office based at the Bartlett School in University College London. His current research interests include energy efficiency, indoor air quality, and building-related health problems. He's been involved in 76 research publications since 2001, attracting media coverage and resulting in changes to the building regulations. He was invited to give evidence to the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee on Energy Efficiency, co-author of a paper for the recent special issue of The Lancet on Energy and Health, a very important publication, and prepared a State of Science review for the Office of Science and Innovation on how to support growth with less energy. Tadj is director of the highly multidisciplinary Complex Built Environment Systems Research Group at UCL and was appointed director of the new UCL Energy Institute in October 2008. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to present Professor Tadj Oreszczyn. And I would say that normally at this point the chairman goes and sits down and can just enjoy the discussion. But I'm something of a guinea pig, as you'll see, so you'll see me appear in another role in a few minutes. But over to Tadj.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for agreeing to be a guinea pig, and thank you all for coming here today when the travel is quite so difficult. I'm going to start off by, first of all, acknowledging all the people whose work I'm going to be talking about. Most of the work I'm going to be discussing has not actually been personally carried out by me, but a lot of my colleagues, both at the Bartlett at University College London, but also at other institutions that we do collaborative research with, and with partners like Barratt Homes and Camden Council. And in particular, I have to acknowledge our funders, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. The context behind the Great British Refurb is very much climate change. And I just thought I'd start off with a brief introduction to some of the issues related to climate change. And there's quite a lot of similarities between the way that the Earth heats up, the way that buildings heat up, and the way that people heat up. And in order to try and explain a little bit of the greenhouse effect, which is a critical factor in climate change, I'm going to do a small demonstration which hopefully will work with an infrared camera. But at the moment, the Earth is heated up by the sun, and the sun is a very hot object, and it gives out most of its radiation in the visible part of the spectrum. Any object which is at 5,000 degrees centigrade will give out heat in the visible part of the spectrum. But cooler objects, like the Earth, emit radiation in the infrared part of the spectrum, and I'm going to attempt to give a demonstration for that. So if I could ask Chris to come back up on the stage, and if we could switch over to the infrared camera. Right, yes, thanks. What does the infrared camera show? Well, the infrared camera picks up the intensity of radiation coming from Chris, and all objects emit infrared radiation, but those objects which are hotter emit more radiation. And here you see the intensity of the radiation shown along the scale you see up the right-hand side, and that is an indicator of the sort of temperature at which the surface is at. And what you can see is that Chris, like a building, is trying to keep warm. He's trying to keep warm at a temperature of about 37 degrees centigrade inside, as opposed to a house which you might be trying to keep warm at 21 degrees centigrade. And he's losing heat, and you can see that very clearly from his face. But he's insulated, and he's insulated with the clothes, and you can see the cooler temperature of his clothes. And you can see that he's got a little bit of loft insulation on the top of his head.
Much less than I used to have.
So we'll do a little bit of a Great British Refurb on him, and we'll give him a little bit more loft insulation. And what you notice very quickly is that now he's radiating far less energy from his head, and therefore the camera is picking up less energy from his head, and therefore it appears darker. We could give Chris a few windows and ask him to put on his glasses.
Prepared earlier.
And what do we see? Well, we don't seem to see very much of Chris's eyes. And in order to explain or demonstrate why that is, I have a sheet of glass here. If I put the sheet of glass between Chris and the infrared camera, then the sheet of glass tends to absorb the infrared radiation. And in fact, glass is a bit like the atmosphere in the Earth, the gases in the atmosphere, the greenhouse gases. The glass absorbs the infrared, and the gases in the atmosphere also absorb the infrared. And if you imagine that Chris's head is the Earth and the camera is outer space, and we put in the atmosphere in there, then what this is doing is preventing some of that heat escaping. And what's happening is that the glass is, in effect, absorbing the infrared radiation from Chris. Now, not all materials do that. And what I'd like to do is to ask Chris to put this over his head. Now, I've been told by Health and Safety to warn everybody not to try this at home. But what you can see and what Chris can't see is that, in fact, some materials don't absorb infrared. Some materials actually can transmit. And if we had an atmosphere that transmitted like that, then what we would find is that the Earth was not quite as warm. If you'd like to take that off for a minute. This actually is transparent in the visible and in the infrared. And you should be able to see Chris quite clearly with that. Okay, if you take that off, and I'm now going to use the same sort of plastic bag, but with some other things inside it. Now, here's a bag of water. It's the same sort of bag. If we now put that in between Chris, what you see is the water, unlike the plastic bag, actually absorbs the infrared radiation. And in fact, the most dominant greenhouse gas is in fact water in the atmosphere. And you will have all experienced this at one stage or other. If you go out on a cloudy night, then generally it's warmer than it is on a clear night. And that's because on a cloudy night, you've got water in the atmosphere that is absorbing some of the infrared radiation, whereas if it's a clear night, then you haven't got those water molecules. Obviously, we've got a lot of them in here, and so it's absorbing it to a very high level. Okay, just a couple more. Now, I'm going to have to use something slightly hotter than Chris's head for a minute. If you want to. to do the last demonstration, but one. So there you can see the hot jug. And if I point the cross at that hot jug now, it will show you roughly the surface temperature. And if you remember before, when the temperature that it was reading was lower, then the object was apparently better insulated. Now, I've got two bags here. Which I'm going to try to demonstrate something. This bag we filled with air, just the room air. And this bag we filled earlier on with one of these, which is a fire extinguisher which has carbon dioxide in it. I had to do this earlier in the typical Blue Peter fashion, because when the carbon dioxide comes out of the fire extinguisher, it's actually very cold, and it has to actually equilibrize to room temperature. And let's see what happens if we look at the top temperature, and it's just saturated, which isn't necessarily a good thing. So let's try and see whether this does work. If not, we might have to try it with Chris instead. Let's try redoing this, actually. We might have to add some cold water in a minute. Let me just see whether it brings it down. Ah, right, okay, it should bring it down. Okay, so this is normal air, and what you should be seeing is that the temperature is now 58.6. This is carbon dioxide, and it's a lot cooler. It's 53 degrees. Well, in fact, it's 40 degrees. So this is because the carbon dioxide in this plastic bag is absorbing the infrared radiation just like the glass was before. It's not doing it as strongly as the glass, but it is actually absorbing it. Okay, and Chris, if you could just sit back very quickly. There's the last few things I just want to demonstrate. One of the reasons, by the way, that infrared cameras are so expensive is, of course, because the lenses are very expensive, because they can't be made out of glass, because you wouldn't see anything with them. If I hold a normal sheet of glass, then you don't see any reflection. If I hold this side of the glass, can you see a reflection on there? And this is doing something very similar to what you get with a normal metal sheet. Some of you may have heard about putting tinfoil behind your radiators. Well, the reason why you might want to do that is because it's very good at reflecting the infrared radiation. In fact, even though it's got scratches on, you actually get a very good image. You don't get a very good image in the visible, and that's because of the different wavelength that we're looking at. But this glass sheet has a property which is similar to a metal sheet, but it also transmits the sun's radiation. And this has a special coating. It's a low emissivity coating. Unfortunately, it's a very old one that's now oxidized. I've been trying to get a new one. Normally, you wouldn't be able to detect that this had a coating on it at all. But if you have double glazed windows with this low emissivity coating on it, then it helps to reflect some of the heat back towards the room. And it therefore means that you can have a double glazed window which has the same thermal properties as a triple glazed window. So thank you very much, Chris. Big round of applause for agreeing to do that. Okay, so hopefully that's given you some general introduction to the greenhouse effect, and that you can even in a room demonstrate some of the properties. In fact, we'd have needed a bag about 3 meters in diameter to replicate the amount of CO2 there is between the ground and the Earth, because that's 100% CO2 in that bag. Okay, let's go the right way. So we need to reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and a large proportion of the balance in the amount of carbon dioxide we have is associated with burning of fossil fuels. Just like Chris keeping his body warm and burning food, he also emits CO2, and when you burn fossil fuels, you will also produce carbon dioxide. And you can see here one of the scenarios for the future, and there are many scenarios produced for the UK, for the world, about how CO2 emissions might change in the future. But this is done by the International Energy Agency, and what you see is that they're predicting CO2 levels to rise into the future to very high levels, which will cause all sorts of climate change problems, unless we can take a load of measures to reduce that, and we really need to reduce it to a trajectory, which is this lower trajectory here, in order to prevent climate change having severe impacts on the way that the whole of the world operates. Now, normally, in almost all scenarios that are carried out, there isn't one technology that can fix the problem. And in fact, each of these wedges here are different technologies that the International Energy Agency has looked at, and that that it's looked at as possibly being introduced into the future to reduce CO2 emissions down to the levels that we need to. And there's carbon capture and storage here, nuclear, renewables, and then this 49% here is actually trying to reduce our demand through more energy-efficient technologies. And it's very difficult to come up with a scenario where one technology will sort it all out. There really is not a scenario where one technology will do it all. You really need to apply almost all of the technologies that we've got available. And we need to do it both on the supply side and on the demand side if we're going to achieve our targets. It's even more difficult than achieving this target in 2050 because we can't simply follow this trajectory and then introduce all of these in 2050 and plonk down here. Because it's the trajectory that's as important, because a molecule of carbon dioxide we release today will add to the greenhouse emissions over the next 100 years or so. So it'll have an effect over 100 years. So if we were to emit one molecule every year for the next 50 years or so, in order to counter that in 2050, we'd have to emit 50 molecules in one go, reduce our emissions by 50 molecules in one go. So it's actually quite important that we start to move in this downhill trajectory. And to do that, we have to use existing technologies. We can't use carbon capture and sequestration at the moment because we haven't developed it fully. But a lot of the energy efficiency technologies we already have available. So just to sort of explain again why tackling the existing domestic buildings are key to tackling climate change. Well, worldwide, about 30 to 40% of all primary energy is used in buildings. And in fact, in Europe it's higher, in developed countries it's higher, and in the UK it's close to 50%. The climate change bill in the UK, we've decided, mandates us to an 80% reduction. And that's a very large reduction in CO2 emissions, and we will need to put all of the tools into action in order to achieve that target by 2050. UK domestic stock is responsible for almost a third of UK greenhouse gas emissions, and still we use a lot of energy for space and water heating, and we will have to tackle that somehow. And it's not the new buildings that are the problem. If we're looking at 2050, then the existing stock is already here, that will be here. It will also be here in 2050. And if all of this wasn't enough reasons to try and look seriously at doing major refurbishment to the UK stock, there are other reasons other than climate change which make it important. There are issues to do with comfort and health in buildings, and to try and eradicate fuel poverty, and also security of energy supply. If we don't tackle demand, energy demand, the infrastructure consequences of building large numbers of power stations, whether they're renewable or nuclear, and the infrastructure to support those will be massive unless we reduce our demand. Now, we're lucky in buildings in that there are a range of different options, and I'm sure most of you are aware of these. Most of these options have been around since the 70s. actually. We haven't really radically discovered a completely new technology over the last 30 years. And they broadly break down into the technologies that reduce heat loss by insulating the walls, either in cavities, internally or externally, reducing the heat loss through windows, reducing the heat loss through ventilation, improving the efficiency of our boilers or using boilers like heat pumps, which have high efficiencies, or using microgeneration technology, solar hot water heating, photovoltaics, micro-CHP, and also better controls systems to make sure that we only use the energy when we really need it. Now, one could argue that we do have the technology to build zero-carbon buildings, and this is a zero-carbon building in the most extreme environments. So we can build these buildings in the most extreme environment. It wasn't zero-carbon to get it up there, I'm afraid, but we do have the technology. In fact, we even have managed to do it on Earth as well, and these are some example buildings that UCL has been involved in. The picture on the left-hand side is of a Victorian house that has been recently refurbished to reduce its carbon emissions by 80%, in theory. And on the right-hand side, one of the new generations of zero-carbon homes, which have been built. However, we have been building homes for a long period of time, and we've also been building energy-efficient homes. The house on the left-hand side here was built in 1985, and the house on the right is another zero-carbon home that is a demonstration home. And in terms of the fabric, if you ignore the renewable energy technologies that have been introduced to these buildings to make them completely zero-carbon, the building on the left has pretty similar thermal properties in terms of the heat loss of the building on the right. The building on the right is not occupied at the moment. It's not being monitored with real people living in it. At least in 1985, we had 3 or 4 of these houses which real people lived in, and where the fuel bills in those days were, I think, close to £5 a year in the building on the left. Now, on one level, we haven't really done a lot over 23 years. And we drastically need to make a very big improvement if we're going to achieve something. So the challenge really is how we deploy the appropriate technology to 24 million dwellings within a very complex system. And I'm going to be giving you some impression of where the complexity in a lot of this problem occurs. But it's not just about designing and building buildings, it's about how people and occupants interact with them, how people use appliances, how people decide to heat them, the environment that they keep in them, and that in fact is partly affected by the price of fuel. And all of that determines how much energy we actually use or how much carbon is emitted. We have more than enough evidence that simply the technology alone will not deliver the solutions. Now, part of the reason why it's so complicated in buildings to understand energy, and why we've done actually very little assessment of the real performance of buildings, is because it's actually something quite difficult to get a handle on. If you have a car, you only use one form of energy in that car predominantly. You put the petrol in it, you drive it around, and that energy is used for one thing, to move you and the car to different places. A building is more complicated. It has many different sources of energy. It can have gas, electricity. It can also utilize the sun's energy. We do lots of different things. We heat the building, but we also run appliances and cookers. And there's some interesting sort of feedback mechanisms that go on. So if you replace your existing light bulbs with low energy light bulbs, they'll give out less heat, so your heating system will have to generate slightly more heat. So it's actually quite difficult to get a complete handle on this, and it's difficult to interpret things. I mean, if you went to the petrol station and asked them to you filled up your car with petrol and you went to pay for it, and they said, well, I'm not sure exactly how much petrol you put in there at the moment, so I'm going to charge you roughly £50 for that. But that's actually what happens with the way we pay our fuel bills sometimes. We have estimated readings, we pay up front for it. We don't really have a good handle. And then we have the extra complexity that it might be a colder winter or a warm winter. So is that's the reason why our energy consumption has gone up or down? And fuel prices have dropped dramatically, certainly up until 2006, down to a stage where we're spending about 3% of our household expenditure on energy. And that's half of what we were spending in 1980. So the real cost, the real effect of energy has become almost negligible for a lot of people. It would be a completely different story if we actually had to rely on a human-powered house. If we were to not use gas and electricity to run all our appliances, but actually to rely on people, then you'd have to have 8 fit athletes working continuously 24/7 for 365 days of the year to meet the average UK house demand. We would notice that if we had to have a basement of 8 people pedalling away, running that. And what's more, if we had to pay them the minimum wage, it would cost us £400,000 a year to run our house. Now, we're probably going to have to move, hopefully not all the way to that, but we're going to have to shift our sort of value and our understanding of how we use energy if we're going to be able to tackle some of the problems that we need to tackle. Okay, so the Great British Refurb. Well, the government has recently had a heat consultation in which it has proposed that one of the aims would be that by 2030, all our homes and other buildings will have received a whole house package of measures that covers all of the cost-effective, energy-efficient measures available for that property at the time, as well as renewable heat and electricity measures needed to meet our renewable energy aims. That is actually a great challenge for us to do that in a way that helps us meet significantly the 80% reduction in CO2 emissions. And the blue line here on the graph shows you the sort of potential ramping up that scheme is talking up. We're talking about moving from a situation where we have hardly zero refurbishment of our existing stock to refurbishing 1.8 million homes a year between 2020 and 2030. Now, the closest we've got to a refurbishment program like that at the moment is something called the Warm Front Scheme, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that later on. But that does really an order of magnitude less number of homes almost, and almost an order of magnitude less in terms of the impact and the expenditure that we're talking about. Okay, this is Carlton House Terrace. This is Buckingham Palace. And this is the Houses of Parliament. And this is the insulation that we will need to install into all of UK houses. It's about 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre. We've got to somehow spread that 1 kilometre cube of insulation across the whole of the UK housing stock. That's one of the things that we will need to do within the Great British Refurb. So how have we done in the past, and what lessons can we learn from the past? Well, as I've explained already, there's actually been very little monitoring and real data about how real buildings perform, for the reasons I've explained earlier on about the difficulty sometimes of interpreting and measuring energy. But this is some data that a colleague of mine, Alex Summerfield, has pulled together using some existing data. And each triangle on this graph is roughly 1,000 homes. And here is the age at which those properties were constructed. The data is all from the same year, so there's no climate impacts. This is not looking at 1930 houses monitored in 1930. This is 1930 houses monitored reasonably over the last couple of years, and their energy consumption. And it's groups of 1,000 homes that we're talking about for each of these triangles. And the good news is that if you draw the best straight line you can try to draw through those points, at least the trend is downwards. Now, 1973 was quite an important year. It was quite an important year for me, personally, because it's when I started to get interested in energy. And one of the reasons why I started to get interested in energy was I was issued one of these, which is a passport to being a grumpy old energy man. It's actually a fuel ration book that was issued in 1973. People talk about carbon rationing as if it's something completely new. But we have had to talk about rationing energy before. And as a result of that, I started to become interested in energy, and since then I've been trying to investigate energy use in buildings. Clearly, I've not had a very big impact. As you can see, there isn't a big kink in the curve. We would have hoped that there would have been a kink. And in fact, that's when we started to introduce building regulations that try to control energy use in our buildings. There's a lot of scatter in there, and the slightly disappointing thing is that we have some buildings, or some estates here, that were built more recently that are using as much energy as those estates in the 1920s. Now, this is the challenge we've set ourselves for new buildings, that by 2016, all new buildings will be zero carbon. And this is actually only a graph of gas energy use. It doesn't cover electricity, and zero carbon will cover both gas and electricity. So we have a major challenge if we're going to actually achieve that target. And as I say, for the last 30 years, we have been trying to do something to tackle energy use in buildings. It's not as if we've been doing nothing. And this is what we're trying to do with existing building stock in terms of the Great British Refurb, which is we're trying to reduce its heating energy by 50%. We will also then have to decarbonise the supply, which we'll have to do by at least 50%, which will bring us down towards the 80% reduction in carbon emissions. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about this scheme, which is the closest we've got to any major refurbishment scheme at the moment in the UK, and it's the Warm Front scheme. Now, before I start, the messages that come out of this are not only applicable to refurbishment projects, they're applicable to new buildings, they're not only applicable to houses, but they're applicable also to the non-domestic stock. And they're not particularly applicable to the UK, although the UK may in some ways be worse than other countries. But many countries experience very similar problems to the problems that we do in the UK. The scheme is not directly trying to achieve reductions in carbon emissions. It's predominantly trying to improve the health and comfort of people who are on low incomes. And they're eligible to free insulation, free heating system, putting in more efficient heating systems, and draft proofing. We were lucky enough to be involved in a project to monitor about 3,000 homes before and after they had this refurbishment. And what were the conclusions from this refurbishment? Well, there was an increase in temperatures in livings and bedrooms, which is very good because that's one of the key things that the scheme is trying to achieve. Improves comfort, people felt much more comfortable. It reduced the fuel costs, so people saved money. It reduced the occurrence of mould, so the buildings were more healthy. And as a consequence of these, we've got some evidence that it improves mental health directly and should also reduce winter deaths. And in the UK, we have something still like 20,000 excess winter deaths. But what does it do to energy use? Well, the mean energy use actually rises by about 34% as a result of this. And even if we look at trying to measure the energy efficiency, in theory, we would have expected the energy efficiency as a result of these measures to improve quite significantly, but we've actually only been able to detect a marginal improvement. So why is that? Why is it that in theory and practice are not the same? Well, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they're not, and that definitely applies in this case. So why is it that theory and practice are not the same in this particular case? Well, we have three hypotheses. One is that we apply the physics wrongly. Not that physics is ever wrong. Physics is always right. It's just the way that we apply it. We don't build or refurbish as we would like to, as we model, and as theoretically we would expect to. And we don't really understand some of the changes that occur in occupant behaviour as a result of this. And in particular, that's an area that we desperately need to get a better understanding. So just to briefly give you examples of these, and I'm not going to go into tremendous detail with this, but in the case of the Warm Front, one of the measures that we introduced was draft stripping. We sealed the buildings to try and reduce the unwanted flow of air into and out of the building. And what we did was we actually pressure tested these houses, and we pressure tested about 140 of these. We put a blower door, the door on the left-hand side that you can see with a big fan, which blew air into the building, and how much air goes through the fan determines how leaky the house is. And what we found was, as a result of installing draft stripping in these buildings, that we got a slight improvement, a slight reduction in the air infiltration, the air going in and out of the building. So we had effectively sealed up the cracks, but only marginally. We had expected at least a 10%, if not better, improvement. Now, if we looked at the houses just which didn't have central heating installed, then yes, we got a much bigger improvement. We got about 14% improvement, which is more like what we had expected. But if we looked at the houses with central heating, then we got an increase of 1%. Now, a very crude way of looking at this is that on one level, you've got a team of people going around sealing up the cracks in the building, and then you've got another team of people going around and putting in central heating and putting in holes in the floors, in the walls, and adding to it. Now, theoretically, all the models that predict energy consumption in buildings say if you put draft stripping in, then the air infiltration reduces, you save energy. But they don't at the moment say if you put a central heating system in, it goes up. And so we haven't been applying the physics correctly there. This is an example for new buildings, and this is some work that was done by a colleague of mine, Bob Lowe, with colleagues at Leeds Metropolitan University, where they were involved in a brand new housing development, where they spent a lot of effort to work with the people on the site to make sure the insulation went into the building properly, that the building was airtight. And then they measured the heat loss of the building, and they found that the heat loss was twice what they had expected. And they spent quite a bit of time trying to work out why this was. And in fact, this is an infrared image, in black and white infrared image, which shows the party wall in the loft space. And they've discovered lots of heat leaking up here into the loft through the party wall. Now, when you pay an energy surveyor to come to your house and give you an energy certificate for your house, they will measure the outside area of the building, because that's where normally we think all the heat is lost, through the outside walls. They ignore party walls and internal walls generally, and that's because party wall is heated on both sides to roughly the same temperature, and so you get no net heat loss, or if you do, it loses heat to the adjacent house, and at least they get some benefit from that. But what they found was that actually modern construction of party walls are actually cavities, and this is the cavity before the outer brick face went on. And this cavity was introduced to stop noise transmission from one neighbour to the other. That's very good, but we sort of ignored that cavity going in, and actually that cavity just acts like a big chimney. What it does is it takes heat from adjacent houses into the cavity, up above the loft insulation and into the roof space where that heat energy is lost. That means that a party wall actually loses more heat than an external wall. That means that a terraced house loses more energy than a detached house. That means that if you put an infinite amount of insulation around the outside of one of these houses, it does still not meet what the building regulations are trying to achieve. Now, the sad thing is that it's taken us 20 years to discover this. This construction has been being built, and it's very simple to fix, particularly when you're building the house. You just need to put some insulation in the party wall, and you fix the problem. It doesn't really cost a lot of money, very cheap to do as you're building it. And we need to build a better, quicker understanding of these sorts of problems, because they are having very large potential impacts. I mean, luckily, as a result of that work, they've now changed the calculations, and they're changing the regulations as a result of that. Not refurbished as modelled. Well, it's actually very difficult to get the insulation into an existing building in all the places that we would ideally want to, and roughly 20%, 13% in the loft is missing. That's not just down to poor workmanship. It's actually just physically quite difficult to get the insulation everywhere that you want to get it in. And we're going to have to work quite hard to make sure we overcome these sorts of problems and to try and get the theory as close to practice as possible. And it happens in new buildings as well. Here you can see heat being lost here, which shouldn't be there. And the last reason to explain the difference between theory and reality is changes in occupant behaviour. And what tends to happen is you add insulation and people take some of that benefit in terms of improved thermal comfort. That's often talked about as the rebound effect, take back, or the comfort factor. And actually, in terms of the warm front scheme, that was one of its aims, was to actually get people to be warmer. But any refurbishment project will suffer from this, not only in the fuel poor. And in fact, people interact with the complex system that you've got in a building in complex ways. And in the case of the warm front scheme, we introduced new, more efficient heating systems, which were more efficient than the existing heating systems. But we didn't take the existing heating systems out, we left them in. And a lot of people carried on using the existing systems, even though they may have been more efficient to use the more efficient system. An extreme example of the rebound effect is an area which I've been carrying out as research for a couple of decades now, which is the domestic conservatory. It's very loved in the UK. We build about 100,000 conservatories in the UK. And about 20 years ago, if you built one and you had your house energy rated, your energy rating would be improved as a result of adding a conservatory. And the reason for this is that the conservatory traps some of the sun's heat, it warms up the space, it's solar heated, and some of that heat permeates into the building, and you've got an extra layer around the outside of the building. However, we had a student who went and visited 10 conservatories, and she found that 9 out of those 10 conservatories were actually heated. Now, if you heat a glass box, and particularly if you heat a glass box attached to a new house, that glass box can double the heat loss of the house. And that's because, the fabric heat loss anyway, because glass, even if it's double glazed, will use 10 times the amount of heat per square metre that a modern well-insulated wall will. And since you've got roughly the 10th of the area, then it will double the fabric heat loss of the building. So it can have a significant impact. The results of that study persuaded the government to fund a much bigger survey. So we sent out a questionnaire asking 100 questions about how people use their conservatories to 5,000 conservatory owners. And probably the most significant finding we had was that we had a tremendous response rate, 30%, which actually shows that conservatory owners are very good at responding to questionnaires. If you're ever planning to do a postal questionnaire, make sure you send it to conservatory owners. But we had a tremendous amount of data about conservatories, and the building regulations people came to us and said, well, okay, you've identified a possible problem, what should we do about it? Should we ban conservatories? And we said, no, you can't possibly do that. We have more evidence than you could possibly want that there'll be revolution on the streets if you ban conservatories. They're the most loved space. People love to have these spaces. You cannot do that. Okay, well, let's make them double glazed. Let's make sure that the regulations say they're double glazed. Well, we looked at the data, and the data showed that double glazed conservatories used twice the amount of energy that single glazed conservatories did. Which, it was at that stage that I'd realised that physics, which is what I'd come from into this area, wasn't going to answer all the problems, because from a physics point of view, double glaze, halve the heat loss almost, and you would expect to halve the energy consumption. But in fact, it had doubled. Why was that? Well, what is happening is that people are taking the benefit of this improved technology to change the way people use these spaces. They're not using these spaces as buffer spaces like they used to. They're using them as spaces to watch TV in the middle of winter when it's 0 degrees centigrade outside. You couldn't do that in the old single glazed lean-to type conservatory. Even if you managed to put in the 10 kilowatt heater to provide the air temperature of 20 degrees into that space, you still wouldn't feel comfortable because the radiant temperature from the glass would make you feel uncomfortable. So the technology has enabled us to change the way we use these spaces and to change behaviour. And we need to better understand all of this if we're actually going to tackle this problem. One way of trying to demonstrate the rebound effect graphically, and I'm not sure whether this will just confuse people or explain things, but if you've got a building here and you reduce its heat loss, you make it more energy efficient, you would expect it to use less energy. And we might go down this line. However, with rebound effects, and this is just a schematic, you can actually get the following curve happening, that actually as you first of all start to reduce, the energy actually goes up and actually stays quite high because people are taking the benefits in terms of improved comfort. And then it starts to reduce only once you've achieved a lot of the measures, and then it starts to actually come down quite quickly. And theoretically, the way that many physicists would have modelled it is actually the green line. We would have said the building is perfectly heated in the first place, and we would expect a big reduction from a small change, because actually we start off with a fully heated building, whereas actually a lot of our buildings are not fully heated. And so there is a big discrepancy between the way that theoretically we've been looking at these issues and what actually happens in practice. And we need to better understand some of these mechanisms. Now, people have also changed the way that we behave in buildings. And this is some work that colleagues of mine have been doing at UCL on an estate in Milton Keynes, where we've gone back to an energy-efficient estate some 16 years after its refurbishment. Sorry, not refurbishment, these are new buildings. They're built as energy-efficient buildings. How do they now perform 16 years later? Well, what we found is that the energy consumption has risen in them, particularly electricity. Electricity has gone up quite significantly. But if we look, and I'm not going to explain the graph in any particular detail, but if we split the groups of people up into those that didn't use a lot of energy 16 years ago and those that did, then what you find is that it's the gas guzzlers 16 years ago which are now gas guzzlers even more. The increase has come from the high-consuming groups predominantly. Now, we've got to start tackling the fuel-rich. We've got policies to cope with the fuel-poor, but we are going to have to start tackling the fuel-rich. It's quite obvious why this happens. They're obviously the people who are more affluent, they're less affected by fuel price, but they also have bigger houses. They have bigger houses with more rooms to put more plasma TVs. They have bigger rooms so they can put bigger plasma TVs in. They have detached houses so they can put bigger extensions on, and they can put more extensions onto the house than if you're living in a terraced house. So we're going to have to start looking at policies that attract that. There is a wide diversity of energy consumption, and I'm not going to go into this graph in any detail. But energy consumption varies tremendously from individuals. And in London, we use slightly less energy. We use slightly less energy in part because we occupy, in some areas of London, very dense occupation. We don't have very big houses in some parts. In other houses, like in the peripheries, we have very low densities, and we have very affluent people in those houses who can use a lot of energy. I would argue we have an almost innate ability to think up new ways of using energy. And these are just some examples. I actually live in Milton Keynes, and this is the biggest building in Milton Keynes. What do we do in there? Well, we have snow in there kept at -2 degrees all of the year round. And we've been able to do that because we've got the energy-efficient technology. What Milton Keynes does one day, Dubai follows the next day, and they've now got a bigger snow dome than we have. But Milton Keynes is trying to keep up pace. We've also got a skydiving centre now, which also can use energy up. We need to tackle health in buildings as well. Our buildings are reasonably healthy at the moment, but we do have excess winter deaths. We have some excess summer deaths. We also have people dying of carbon monoxide. We need to be careful that when we do carry out the Great British Refurb, that actually we don't make things worse. We suspect in most cases we will make things better, but we will need to put a lot of effort in to make sure that that really happens and really delivers. So just to conclude, I think the Great British Refurb is essential if we're going to hit our targets of carbon emissions reductions. We're going to have to tackle the energy use in our existing building stock, and we're not going to have to just tackle it by a small amount. If we do it by a small amount, we're likely to actually increase our energy consumption. We're going to have to do big changes to put us over the hump. It's going to be the greatest engineering challenge this century, I believe. It will not be easy or cheap. For a long period of time, grumpy old energy men like myself have been going around trying to convince the government to do something about the built stock. We've probably oversold how easy it is and how cheap it is, and they're going to get us on that one if we're not careful. It's going to be quite a strong government who's going to actually push through on doing these changes. These changes will have to be supported by advances in technology, but also a better understanding of how we interact with that technology. We'll need to have real verification that we really are going in the right direction. We can't afford to wait another 20 years to find out we've done the wrong thing. We need to both monitor what's happening, and smart meters will help us do that. There are a whole range of technologies that will come into place. We're going to have to change the way we do research in this. We can't spend 10 years simply finding out that something doesn't work. Those results will be too late if we're going to actually have reduced the energy consumption of our stock. But we're also going to have to educate people on site. We're going to have to improve supply chains. Contracting is going to have to change quite radically, probably more to do with output-based contracting rather than input-based contracting. We're going to have to develop an industry. We really do not have an industry at the moment, but it's going to have to become something like a £10 billion industry in the next 10 years. We're going to have to take care that we don't cause other problems, that we don't make buildings overheat more. We don't have to do that, but we're going to have to be very careful and that they do become more healthy. And this has got to go hand in hand with other policies. You cannot just rely on the Great British Refurb. It will have to go on hand in hand with policies associated with trying to reduce emissions in other ways. Rises in fuel prices. We expect that probably by 2050, fuel prices will have to go up by a factor of 5. We'll have to regulate more and we'll have to decarbonise our supply if we're going to achieve the 80% reductions. Thank you.
Well, Tadj, thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating lecture. We do have time now for some questions from the floor. We have a microphone on each side. I'll move into the middle so that I can see a bit better. And what we'll try and do is line up the next question as the first question is being asked. And could you perhaps just stand and give your name or any association that you may have when you give a question, please? The first question is the gentleman at the back. And anybody else to follow? I think this lady was first, and then there are two here. So one there and one there.
Hello, my name is James. A slightly selfish question to begin with. I was just wondering, if this was to happen to my house, how much money you could save me on my yearly outgoings, how much money it would save me or another person who went through the same refurb?
Right. Well, some of the houses that you have seen, in fact, the house that I showed earlier on, the refurbed house here, was reduced its energy consumption by 80%. This house on the left, which was a refurb. It can go further. It's a question, though, of balancing the costs. And we're not actually great supporters of zero carbon homes. We think to go to completely zero carbon means investing a lot of money in achieving the last bit of carbon reduction. The first bit is always easier and cheaper to achieve. And actually, there will probably be better ways, not necessarily introducing distributed generation, but having centralised generation, which may be cheaper, rather than everybody trying to build an autonomous house almost, which is not a sensible thing to be doing.
Lady here, and then I think there's a gentleman just... yes, there we are. Thanks.
Hello, Anna Eager, and I work for the Shoreditch Trust, and I'm working on a project at the moment on CHP project, Combined Heat and Power project, retrofitting into council estates. But I wanted to ask about the work that you're doing in the research and whether you'd looked at the Decent Homes programme, because it seems to me that's the closest to what we're talking about in terms of the scale of the work and the fact that you're dealing with inhabited properties. So I think that's one of the things, and I wanted to know if you knew how much research had been done there and how much of that was applicable. And I wanted to talk a bit about, to ask about the behaviour thing. I think one of the things I'm constantly assailed with is people saying, well, we've got to be careful with this because people will just open windows, i.e. they'll waste the energy if the energy's cheap. And I think one of the things about people keeping the gas fires and things like that is their experience of local authorities being very poor at maintenance and fixing things. So I think there's one of the issues that we're dealing with is a very strong belief system with lots of the communities that we work with that's based on the fact that they're used to getting quite a poor service. So one of the things, when we're talking about solving this, we have to talk about, it seems to me, communitarian type solutions, i.e. combined heat and power, or other things that are about joining up communities and delivering this stuff. And I think that's against a background of people's experience of getting quite a poor service. Sorry, that was a bit rambling.
Okay, there's quite a few questions there. Decent homes, I am aware of the decent homes. I'm not aware of a major monitoring exercise actually having been undertaken, but I would anticipate that a lot of the lessons will also be learnt, similar lessons will be learnt in the decent homes as is being learnt from monitoring the Warm Front scheme. I mean, you're absolutely right, the behaviour is critically important, and our understanding of how people interact with the technology and how they perceive the technology is critically important, and there hasn't been a lot of work carried out in that. I personally believe that we will have to increase the price of energy in order to make people think about it in a way that currently they don't think about it. We can try thinking of other ways of doing that, but it's actually very difficult to think of another way of doing that. I would love to come up with a solution that would actually try and motivate people that didn't involve money, but I haven't been aware of one. There are other things that help and can facilitate that, but I think we will have to raise the price of fuel, because energy actually gives us great things. And like I say, we can think up an infinite number of ways of using that energy, and we will carry on doing that while it is so cheap. So I think we will have to change things. I think we do need to be very careful about how the technologies we introduce and that the technologies are understood by everybody. There are real problems and issues about changing how people behave, and you mentioned opening windows. We've been trying to do some research in trying to understand how people change their behaviour in terms of opening windows. It's actually quite difficult to do that. But the most extreme example of this is that a large number of elderly who are the most susceptible to health-related problems associated with cold temperatures, half of them, the last survey that I saw, actually slept with their windows open. Now, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing it, I believe, because 20 or 30 years ago, that was exactly the right thing to be doing. If you're in an unheated bedroom, you need to get rid of the moisture out of it. So the most healthy thing would be to actually open the windows. But if you're now in a heated bedroom, then actually closing the windows and keeping the heat in is probably the sensible thing. That will stop mold growing, it will reduce dust mites and things like that. It's very difficult to get people to change their behaviour, and we're going to have to look at that. And the similar sort of thing happens in the summer. You know, what do we do when it gets hot outside? We fling open our doors and windows and we let all the heat into the building so that that's all stored up for later on in the day, which is not what is done in the continent. They shut the house up. These sorts of changes can take a long time to introduce, and we need to start thinking about how we're going to educate people into using our buildings in different ways from the ways that they've been traditionally expected to use them.
Gentleman here on the...
Joe Tatton-Brown of the HeatSave Group. I've been studying, the HeatSave Group's been studying gas communal heating systems run by local councils for the last 5 years. And during that course of the studies, it's because I own two flats which are heated by gas communal heating systems, one in Kensington, Chelsea, one in Islington. And I noticed after 9 years that my tenant had the window open while the heating was on. So I looked into how much heat was going out through that window. And for a one-bedroom flat, it takes about 24,000 kilowatt hours a year to heat that of gas. Now that's slightly more than we use, my wife and I, in a 4-bedroom house with 3 people in it to heat the house. And I've got figures for 10 boroughs. One of the things we've discovered, is that there is one heating system, the Pimlico District Heating Unit run by Westminster, which heats 3,000 dwellings. It's one of the largest in Central Europe. It was actually built in the 50s, and it takes about 17,000 kilowatt hours to heat a two-bedroom flat, which is really quite efficient. And this is a good example of heating system. It has a lot of very good designs. It's centrally controlled. The heat given out by the system is reduced on hot days. They take sensors. It's called a weather compensating system. These systems have been in existence, I think, for 10 years or so. Yeah. But my borough, Kennington Chelsea, doesn't even seem to have heard of them. It's also quite unaware of this very well-designed system, which is only about 2 or 3 miles away. Why is it not that the well-designed systems are publicised and examined by the other councils? There's roughly 3% of the dwellings in London, that's 90,000 dwellings, are heated by these communal heating systems, and about 3/4 of them are extremely inefficient. And it's also very, very hard to get figures, but I have got figures for 10 boroughs. And this is not an area you haven't mentioned. Why is it that people do not look at good examples, good practice, and publicise them?
Yeah. The next question will be this gentleman here, and then the last question, I think, was somebody... Yes, just in the middle there. Thank you. So,
I mean, I totally agree. There are lots of good systems around and lots of lessons to be learnt. And it's important that we learn the good things, and also important that we learn from the bad things, because there are solutions to almost all of the problems that we've identified. But the reason is that there has been very little motivation for anybody up until very recently to actually achieve real reductions. Because the motivation hasn't been there, it's been far easier for policymakers to believe in the theoretical performance than the actual performance, because the theoretical performance always gives the answers that the policymakers are looking for. The actual ones, unfortunately, never give the answers. But I think there's been a major change in the way that policymakers are looking at this, and they realise that now it's not just a case of making things theoretically more energy efficient, but it's now a real case of reducing absolute carbon emissions, because that's what the legislation is looking for. And they realise now that they need to better understand. They need to have the results from real buildings, to learn from good ones, and transmit that information. The challenge is how we're going to do all of that in a relatively short period of time, to pull out the good lessons and feed them through to everybody that will need to, and to monitor the programme that will be put into place, and quickly learn as quickly as possible in that process.
Yes, thank you. I'm Paul Eakins. I'm currently at King's College London, but I'm shortly moving to the UCL Energy Institute to join Tadj, and I'm looking forward to that. Tadj, as you know, the Germans have already started something that approximates your Great British Refurb in terms of insulating the existing housing stock. And I was talking to a friend over there who mentioned 2 other potential problems that they have now become aware of, which you haven't mentioned at all, and which you could probably give another very erudite lecture on. But I wondered if you could just touch on the ways in which insulation interacts with both ventilation and condensation within buildings, because that seems to be something which is very often overlooked when people insulate their homes, but which is a very important set of issues.
Yeah. I skipped through, I'm afraid, the health bit, and one of the biggest challenges is the issue of ventilation, because once you make the fabric well insulated, then you have the challenge of the ventilation, heat loss, and that can be the dominant form of losing heat. Now, we can't just shut off the ventilation because of the water vapour that we all produce in the buildings. That has to be taken out of the building if we're not to get problems of condensation, of mould growth, and of house dust mites, which can give us asthma and other things, or exacerbate the symptoms for asthma, I should say. There are technical solutions to these problems. Whole house mechanical ventilation is one of the technical solutions to this problem. But the problem is when you then put people in to operate and control these systems, you can actually flip the system over to a more vulnerable system reliant on mechanical systems which are more susceptible to failure, and when they fail, to causing bigger problems. And this is an area that we really need to better understand and investigate.
Last question then from the gentleman there. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. George Stowell, Chartered Architect. I was very interested in your graph with the downward sloping demand curve for in relation to the rebound effect, the theoretical physical line and the actual measured lines, or the theoretical lines when you were taking into account the measures that were taken. And it was very interesting, I thought, that the rebound effect that you've measured in your sample size pretty much works out with Terry Barker's work that's just recently been published out of his department in Cambridge about the underestimation by governments of rebound effects. But I was very interested that the curve came down to the corner axis, and I just wonder whether you could explain what particular policy choices, levers or reasons that line came down to the curve, and how your thinking in that area may well influence policy in the future. Thank you.
Well, that curve was created by utilising real temperature data that we monitored as part of the warm front scheme. So it's actually taking the data that we've got, which shows how the internal temperature changes as we improve the levels of insulation in those buildings, and eventually it saturates. We don't carry on raising the temperature in the house. Eventually it saturates, and when it saturates, you start then following the traditional curve going down. So that's why you're getting that. We did actually have a project where, well, I briefly mentioned, where we went back to houses that had been built 16 years ago, which were energy efficient when they were built. And we looked at the temperature there to see whether there'd been any drift in temperature over the 16 years. Because we'd hypothesised that people had become wimps, and that over time people were progressively wanting higher and higher and higher and higher temperatures. But the evidence from that field study suggests that that isn't happening, that we're not continually demanding temperatures. The temperatures in those houses now are very, very similar to the temperatures that they were 16 years ago. So hopefully that answers that question.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed for your questions. I hope when you go home tonight and sit in your conservatory watching TV, you'll feel guilty. And when you go to bed, if you open the window, similarly, you will sleep badly. But I'd like to offer a vote of thanks on your behalf and mine to Tadj for a most interesting and illuminating lecture. Thank you very much.